Okay. Just catching those up that are joining the webinar now that I've started the recording. We've talked about we're going to be building a understanding of how to teach, how to set up the entry that we're going to write, and we've just introduced what's called the instructional context. That's the first thing where we actually write about the students that we're working with. So we're going to, looking at that dimensions table on page 22, you'll see some ideas that they give you to help you brainstorm how you know your students. For example, the first box says making knowledge accessible to all students, understanding of students' backgrounds and experiences and knowledge, their previous school performance, any special skills, their learning styles, any challenges and attitudes about school. Knowing all those things help you make knowledge accessible to all students. And so in the boxes beside it, what am I currently doing and what else can I be doing? You can brainstorm where your strengths, where your areas for growth within that category of knowledge. The next one, knowledge of students at this age, that developmental piece of what's appropriate for teaching these students at this time in this setting. That is going to be a very reflective piece for you, especially as you provide evidence of what you're doing and why it's the appropriate time to be setting those goals and implementing those strategies for those kids at that time. So that's a big piece. Respect and consideration for individual, cultural, linguistic, and family differences. You want to be able to plan activities that are appropriate for all learners of all backgrounds. And so considering some of the pieces that may play into a child's living situation, their ethnicity, their language, all of those pieces are things that you consider to make sure that you're maximizing the impact of learning that you have on those students. And then, of course, knowledge of students' self-concept, motivation, relationships with peers and adults. You definitely keep a pulse on students and their well-being and how it motivates them from day to day. So that's another piece for you to brainstorm strengths and our areas for growth. The next section is actually the planning phase for instruction. This is where taking what you have or what you know about students, then you start to build on what is appropriate, what goals need to be set at a particular time and place, and then where you want to go from there. So in the second part of the portfolio instructions, you'll actually see describe the planning process. You'll see questions that elicit you to give that information, types of methods and materials you'll use, how you justify the choices that you make, and based on connecting back to that instructional context. For these students in this setting, you'll see that a lot, and that are influenced by the planning for this instruction. So you've got the instructional context, and then based on what you know about your students, you plan for that instruction. Whoever is reading or assessing your entry should feel that your choices are grounded, that they're logical and academically grounded. The assessor must be convinced that you know your students and that you know the content and the best way to teach it. And those go back to those core propositions. Just looking back in your book really quick on pages 26 and 27. 23 through 27, really. You'll see they spend a lot of time on that architecture. Remember, I introduced that to you back in the beginning. One of our first sessions, we talked about the progression of that architecture of accomplished teaching, and there it is for you in your book, so you can see how the architecture really maps out what that learning entry is going to be about. So we're in that second phase of setting high, worthwhile goals, and then, of course, planning that instruction to attain the goals based on the students and what you know. Part 3 of the entry that you're going to complete, this is where you're going to provide analysis of your teaching. You're going to refer to the videotape segment and evidence that you saw. You're also going to talk about assessment that you conducted and either formal or informal things that informed you about the effectiveness of your teaching. You'll write about activities and how it furthered the student learning, and you'll notice it says or not. Perhaps there were some misconceptions or students didn't get it, and then of course you're going to talk about how you were able to probe the students' thinking, address those misunderstandings, and explain why what you did actually may be different from what you planned to do. Maybe you capitalized on a teachable moment. Maybe you saw that there was some misunderstanding and you had to reteach an element before moving forward. And then explain how well the students understood the lesson and how you know. What kinds of assessments were you engaged in through the learning sequence, either before, after, or during the videotape, and how does that inform your instruction? Keeping in mind when the assessor reads your written commentary, they are going to read your commentary, then they're going to view the video to be sure that it authenticates that what you say is true. But all the evidence that you get scored really needs to be in your actual written commentary. That's the piece that's going to be most important in explaining that you know what happened and why it's important. You're being asked to analyze student work, evidence of student learning, your practice on videotape, and one or more particular strategies that you choose. So there's definitely that difference in descriptive, analytical, and reflective writing. National Board spells it out back in your book at the beginning of section 4. And so it talks about that descriptive writing being retelling what happened in the classroom situation, makes no judgments or justifications, uses descriptive writing, questions, uses verbs. It tells the story of what's going on. And then when I get to that analyze piece, that's where I'm talking about writing with real reasons and motives and interpretation. This is the process you will analyze both your students and yourself. Analytical writing can be the most difficult because you have to reach beyond the facts, think deeply, and make those connections, and question and justify. Analytical writing begins when you, in your entry questions, when they ask why or in what ways. So you'll have to engage in some of that analysis in this section on analysis, especially when you reflect on it. Then you've got that reflective writing comes naturally in that part 4, which is reflection. How did you learn? What did you learn about your students in the curriculum? What did you learn about yourself? How will that knowledge be used? What parts of your instruction work well? What evidence supports your conclusions? Identify parts of your instruction that could have been done differently. What would you do in the future with this learning sequence and with the students? What were the results what you expected? The key in this written commentary is that you clear, consistent, and convincingly tell what your learning sequence is about. Your portfolio entries must lead the reader through your decision-making process, not just describing what happened, but help them get an understanding of what exactly happened and how you know it was important that it happened or why you made certain decisions that you did. They should not be surprised at all by a decision that you make because you're mapping them carefully through your decisions as you write. You'll see when you look at the questions in the directions for the written commentary, questions are written in italics and they're followed by clarifying questions that are not written in italics. And I'm going to show you an example of that in a minute. Please pay attention to both of these. The non-italicized portion are very helpful in helping you dig for that analysis in your portfolio writing. So here's an example. What are the central features of 3 segments selected for the videotape? And then you'll see, explain how 3 segments support different aspects of inquiry. So if I just read it, what are the essential features of the 3 segments of selected for the videotape, I might not have realized that I needed to discuss how they support aspects of inquiry. That is a key piece for an AYA science teacher to include. So that's where that plain text that follows out of italics is going to be very important. Here's an example of a prompt and how to break it out. What are the central features? You'll see that question again. So what do? That's where you describe your written commentary, describe your videotape segments. What will they see when they view it? And then in that piece of explain how the 3 segments support different aspects of the inquiry process, then you're going to analyze the 3 segments and really dig into how they're connected to that inquiry process. So hopefully you're seeing with this example the difference in the descriptive part of the writing and then the analysis, the analytical piece. I'm telling what the segments are about, and then I'm using that analytical writing to explain how the segments reach that inquiry process. And so here's an example. I'll give you just a minute to take a look at the first prompt, and I'll read it to you guys in just a second. And then if you don't mind jotting on your paper what you think you must do. Okay, and I'm getting a question popping up about how you can have 3 segments of the video if you can't start or stop the videotape. Some people, that is AYA science, so that is what their directions say, meaning their directions tell them to have 3 segments of a videotape. So some of us have different rules for videotaping. It is very important that you pay attention to what your certificate area rules are. For example, me as an early childhood generalist, my entry for what I would have done for take 1 would have been 1 continuous 15-minute segment, not 3 separate segments. So excellent question. Look at your directions. Some of you may have a segmented video and some of you may not. So you'll have to pay attention to what your directions ask you to do. This example for practice for us is from early adolescent math. So it says, identify what you consider to be the critical moments or choices you made during the instruction that impacted the direction of the lesson. And then describe the events and state how they were important. Assess how they impacted discourse. So if someone will take a look at what and write what I must do. If you are EA Math, what do you think you might do to answer the italicized part of the prompt? And then if someone wants to write into the question pane how they would, what they think they must do to answer the non-italicized part. And I'll share an example with everybody when I see one pop up. All right, let's take a look right here. Is there someone who can tell me what they might be required to do to answer this piece? Y'all gonna make me do it without help today. All right, I'll take it through this first part, and then maybe we'll see somebody pop it up. Okay, thank you. I see somebody's popped up. Describe any changes you made in the lesson. So let's go back and look. Identify what you consider to be critical moments or choices that you made during the instruction that impacted the direction of the lesson. So tell about the moments. Identify what you consider. Describe those moments or choices made where you made changes in the lesson. Then, the second part, describe events and state why they were important. Assess how they impacted discourse. So what's going to be key pieces there? You've described the events. Now what do they want you to tell in the second part? Tell why you made the changes and how it was beneficial. Very well said. All right, good example. Thank you both very much for volunteering. All right, here's another example of unpacking a prompt. When you look at the actual prompt, what characteristics of the selected work samples demonstrate students' ability to understand and interpret text? What do you first do? You have to analyze. What are you going to be asked to do? You're going to analyze student responses to text, and the evidence is going to be the how and where is the understanding demonstrated in students' responses. What different ways could the text have been interpreted? And what does the student's interpretation indicate about the learning? So there's a lot that can be said when you look at the question, what characteristics of the selected work samples. You probably won't have a question that looks specifically like that because that is an entry on one question. but it's a good way to start looking at what the different types of questions could be. I don't want to go back to your homework yet. I want everybody to take a look now with me. If you turn to page 46 in your book, it's the page after the resources. You'll see it actually talks about how to draft your instructional context, and that was the first piece that we worked with that actually talked about how. I'll turn to the homework section because y'all are going to see what you're going to be able to work on for the next time. Oops. Okay. You'll see on page 46, it talks about the purpose of the activity is for you to write a draft of your instructional context. The outcome of the activity will serve as the first part of your written commentary. So the first thing you have to do is find out what questions you have, as it states there. Go to the written commentary for your selected entry and find the instructional context piece and the italicized questions that you must answer. So I tell you what, very quickly, I will demonstrate how to go and look for that information for you guys. I'm going to pull up the website, and that's where I'm going to get my information from. Okay, the fastest way for me to get there to you guys, I go to certificate areas, and I'm going to pull up Early Childhood Generalist, since that's my certificate area. Of course, this information is for you on your CD. I'm just getting to it quickly. All right, these are my portfolio instructions. That's where I'm working. And I know as an Early Childhood Generalist and as a Take 1 candidate, mine would be entry 3. So I'm going to pull that one up. The fast way to get there is to go look at to use the ribbon, the bookmark pane, and scroll down to, for me, which would be entry 3, which is integrating math and science. When I click on, and that works for on your CD or on the web, when I click on that section, then my directions pop up, and immediately I can see some important things like the standards that this entry focus on. So those are going to be key important pieces that I'm going to read. We talked about it a little bit last week. The scoring, the actual rubrics for evidence is below. And then if I keep scrolling through, I'll see something about unifying concepts and processes for scientific inquiry. And then I'll see the section on what I need to do. So that kind of maps out what's going to be expected, how many pages do I have. For my video entry, this is where I will find out the information about segmented or not segmented sections. How much time do I have? Notice I have 15 minutes in length. I cannot edit mine at all. It gives me some information about recording and equipment. Choosing instructional materials. I told you you're going to have a piece about writing, you're going to have a piece about videotaping, and you're going to have a piece about instructional materials. And then composing the written commentary, and you'll see there's the first section on instructional context. So now that we've found the questions, we are set to start thinking about our instructional context. And I mentioned reviewing the standards. You'll see that on page 46. They remind you to do that too as it relates to the questions you're being asked. And it says what relevant characteristics of this class influence your instructional strategies for this learning sequence. So, for example, because this is a math and science entry, I'm going to have to think about my students and their characteristics and everything I know about them in light of them as math and science learners. So for me, that's going to be important. It suggests you take notes using the worksheet that comes on page 47 to help make notes about your instructional context, and then go ahead and make a draft of it. And then we're actually going to share some drafts next week. I'm going to encourage you as you write your instructional context to email them to me and or to Jenna. And then we're going to, if you don't mind, in the email, give us permission to share yours in the session next week. And, of course, bring yours because we're going to provide some feedback to those online. And then, of course, you'll be able to look at yours as we share. So you'll notice for me, I'm looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions about my instructional context here that I can focus on. But as we were provided earlier, you were going to have to give some significant information to prove that I knew very well about my students. So that's going to be a key important piece. Okay, let me go back a little bit and show you what I'm talking about one more time. Curriculum, students, and setting. All very important that you communicate these important pieces that you're tying together before you begin the planning and the implementation of your lesson or of your learning sequence. Communicate that knowledge of students. So I'm flipping back through to that last slide again. So for the next time, you're going to complete your first draft of the instructional context. Use 46 and 47 to help you with that. Identify the content standard that you will address in your written commentary. This content standard should be aligned with national board standards and or your state and local standards. Bring to the next session, make sure you have your handout or your handbook, your portfolio instruction standards guide, scoring guide, and of course evaluation of evidence. It is 4:30. That's a little bit earlier than normal, but I wanted to make sure we had some time to really talk through the writing piece and see what questions you have before you go off and write on your own. So I'm going to stop talking at this point, and I'm going to open up the questions box for me to just answer your questions as we go for the benefit of everybody. And the first question I have is, when we videotape, are there specific sections you would recommend? Because 15 minutes seems really short, and you can can we put together clips on different days? No, and when you get, we're going to talk specifically about videotaping next time, but we'll talk about the planning and instruction piece and then get into videotaping. But I will say it's very important for you to, since you're starting to think about that, look ahead at the other parts of your written commentary and what you're expected to do, and you'll see that National spells out exactly what to feature in that segment, and it is short, keeping in mind that your videotape authenticates that what you say in your written commentary is true. So it is documentation that things really happen within the learning sequence. But the questions in your written commentary also give you the opportunity to talk about what happens prior to the videotape and following, so that you can pull the whole piece together for the assessor. Excellent question. I'm monitoring the questions to see what you have. Should you write everything, or should you include graphs and charts when describing your students? I'm not even sure that I know how to answer that question. You have to start looking carefully at your directions to see if graphs and charts, I don't know that they're even allowed in the written commentary portion. A graph or chart might be useful or might be available. You might be available to put it in the instructional materials, but then it would be as it relates to the instruction. So my hunch is you need to stick with written commentary because that is what they map out as the format for your entry. Any other questions? The question just came up, are the recorded sessions being sent out after each meeting? That's a question I'll also email to Jenna. I know that the last one was sent out, was a YouTube link that you might have gotten, and so it was perhaps the one before that one that didn't go out. So I'll see if she can get that one to you specifically. It was a link that came up on a YouTube site. Yeah, and it would have come from Jenna in your email. So check, and then I'll get her, of course, to resend it also. I'm going to stop the recording on this one because I think we've gotten through the meat of it. And then, of course, I'll hang out a little bit longer, see if we have any more questions.